The air in Mr. Henderson's office was thick, heavy with the scent of old paper and the ghost of my husband, George. My stomach churned, a knot tightening with every rustle of the legal documents. I heard the numbers before I fully understood them, $48 million. It wasn't a whisper, it was a shout in the silence, a seismic shift that cracked open my quiet world. My George, ever the planner, had left me not just a comfortable retirement, but a fortune. And that was the moment I realized nothing would ever be the same again, but I had no idea the worst was still to come. Before George passed, our life in Derby was simple, comforting. We'd had our share of ups and downs, like any couple married for 50 years. Our son, Robert, was a good boy, if a bit easily led, and his wife, Brenda, always seemed a little ambitious. I'd seen it in her eyes, even on their wedding day, a calculating glint that I'd always tried to ignore, hoping it was just youthful eagerness. George, bless his heart, adored Robert and doted on our grandchildren. He'd worked hard his entire life, building up his small engineering firm from nothing. We'd always lived modestly, enjoying our garden, our regular trips to the local pub, and quiet evenings by the fire. I remembered one crisp autumn evening, just a few months before he got sick, George holding my hand and telling me, "Margaret, we've built a good life, haven't we? Enough for us, and a little extra for the kids." He'd smiled, that gentle, reassuring smile of his, and I'd felt truly content. But now, with Mr. Henderson's words echoing in my ears, that contentment shattered. The little extra had become an empire, and I could already feel the vultures circling. The first sign, subtle as it was, came that very evening. My phone, usually quiet, buzzed with a text from Brenda. "Thinking of you, Mom. We should all have dinner soon, just family." It seemed innocent enough, but a prickle of unease started to spread. Brenda hadn't suggested a just family dinner in years, not unless she needed a babysitter. It was a pattern interrupt, a sudden warmth that felt strangely out of place, almost like a predator adjusting its mask. My George had left me a legacy, but I was beginning to suspect it might also be a target on my back. And as I stared at Brenda's text, a cold dread snaked its way into my heart, whispering, "This is just the beginning. We need you to sign over the money, Margaret. It's for the family." The words hung in the air, sharper and colder than the ice clinking in our water glasses. Brenda's smile was gone, replaced by a look I'd never seen before, a hard, unblinking determination. My son, Robert, sat beside her, his gaze fixed on his hands in his lap, a telltale sign of his unease. This was it. The moment the mask had dropped. The very reason for this family dinner. My heart dropped into my stomach, a familiar, sickening thud. The betrayal wasn't a whisper, it was a demand, delivered with the casual cruelty of a business transaction. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, a feeling of humiliation and shock. I had no response. And that was the moment I realized just how much they were willing to take, but I didn't yet know they had a whole legal plan laid out for me. The evening had started so differently. The restaurant was far too fancy for a Tuesday night, all velvet booths and hushed voices. When we arrived, Brenda was a flurry of hugs and compliments, a warmth I hadn't felt from her in years. "You look so wonderful, Mom," she'd said, pulling me into a hug that felt more like a quick check for weapons. Robert, meanwhile, had insisted on paying for the most expensive bottle of wine. I had almost felt a pang of guilt, thinking I had been too hard on her. Maybe she was trying to bridge the distance that had grown between us over the years. We made small talk about the grandkids and our simple life, but every question felt rehearsed, every laugh just a little too loud. It was all a build-up, a meticulously crafted illusion. As the waiter cleared the plates, the conversation shifted. Brenda leaned forward, her elbows on the table. You know, Mom, we've been talking. It's a huge responsibility, all that money. Robert and we're in a better position to handle something like that. We could put it in a trust, for the grandkids. Her tone was still sugary, but the words were a poison, laced with a logic that made my head spin. I watched my son nod along, silent, complicit. It was an assault, not a conversation. My thoughts raced back to George, to his kind eyes and calloused hands. He'd worked his entire life for this. And now, they were trying to take it, not with a threat, but with a smile. I looked at my son, his face a mask of false concern, and a cold wave of clarity washed over me. The kindness was a lie, and the dinner was the trap. Why would they do this to me? I thought, my mind racing. Then, Brenda reached into her handbag and pulled out a slim manila folder, setting it on the table with a soft thud. We even had the papers drawn up for you, she said, her smile returning. My heart pounded against my ribs. It was no longer a request, but an ultimatum. The slim manila folder rested on the tablecloth, a symbol of their audacious demand. Brenda's smile was sweet, almost sickly. Just a signature, Mom. It's for the grandkids. I stared at the folder, then at my son, who still couldn't meet my eyes. The wine, the compliments, the forced laughter, it all made sense now. It was all a trap. My own heart, which had been racing with shock, settled into a slow, cold resolve. I'm not signing anything, I said, my voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the restaurant's quiet hum like a shard of glass. And that was the moment their masks shattered, revealing a truth more painful than any lie. The change was instantaneous. Brenda's smile didn't just fade, it vanished, replaced by a scowl so venomous it made me flinch. Her eyes, moments ago sparkling with false affection, were now two hard chips of flint. What did you just say? She hissed, her voice low and dangerous. This money is a responsibility, Margaret. You're too old to handle it. You'll be fleeced in a week. We're trying to protect you. The words were a bitter pill, coated in a false concern that only highlighted the raw greed beneath. It was the first emotional blow, a direct hit that confirmed my deepest fears. Their love had been conditional, a transaction waiting for a price. A small voice in my head, one that sounded a lot like George, reminded me of who I was. I wasn't an invalid or a fool. George had trusted me. He'd entrusted me with everything we built together. I remembered a conversation we'd had on the porch swing just a few months before he passed. That money isn't for anyone else, Margaret. It's for you. For the life you deserve. He'd squeezed my hand, his knuckles rough and warm. The memory filled me with a quiet strength that made Brenda's insults feel hollow. I lifted my chin, looking directly at my son, who still said nothing. This isn't about protecting me, I stated, my voice firmer now. This is about you trying to take what George and I worked for. And I won't let you. Brenda slammed her hand on the table, causing the silverware to jump. Fine, she snapped, her face flushed with rage. If you want to be selfish, be selfish. Don't come crying to us when you lose it all. She stood abruptly, grabbing her handbag. My son, Robert, finally looked up. His eyes weren't filled with anger, but with a defeated exhaustion that was a worse kind of betrayal. Mom, he mumbled, don't do this. He didn't mean don't refuse, he meant don't make us look bad. They turned and walked away, leaving me sitting alone at the expensive table, surrounded by the wreckage of our evening. The waiters eyed me with silent pity, but I barely noticed. I was too busy staring at the empty chairs, the half-eaten food, and the stark, new reality. I was now an opponent, not a family member. The dinner was over, but the war had just begun. The phone rang just a few minutes after I got home, the screen displaying a picture of Robert's family at Disneyland. My heart leapt. Maybe he was calling to apologize, to tell me he was sorry. But it wasn't his voice that answered. "Margaret," Brenda's tone was tight, strained. "I'm calling to tell you that we've decided we need some space. This whole situation is just unhealthy." The lie was so transparent it almost made me laugh. It wasn't about space or health, it was the start of the punishment. The first quiet strike in their new campaign of emotional warfare. My hands, still shaking from the confrontation, gripped the phone tighter. And that was when I realized they had moved from demanding the money to trying to erase me from my own family. The next few days were a blur of silence. The daily texts from Brenda, once a saccharine stream of false affection, simply stopped. No more pictures of the grandkids. No more invitations to Sunday dinner. I'd always seen myself as the matriarch, the center of our family. Now, I felt like a planet suddenly cast out of orbit, spinning alone in the cold darkness. A painful memory surfaced from a few months prior, before George passed. Brenda and I were going through old photo albums, and she'd paused on a picture of Robert as a boy, a mischievous grin on his face. "He's always been so protective of you, Margaret," she'd said, a touch of genuine fondness in her voice. The memory was a cruel joke now, a reminder of the kindness that had been weaponized against me. I tried to reach out. I left a voicemail for Robert, my voice cracking as I told him I missed him. I texted Brenda a simple "thinking of you" message. There was no reply. Their silence was a calculated form of torture, a psychological assault designed to make me feel isolated, powerless, and desperate for their approval. I thought of a time a few years ago when I'd fallen ill and Brenda had sent a get-well card. It had been filled with handwritten well wishes, a small gesture that had meant the world to me. Now, the memory of that card felt like a bitter mockery of her current coldness. This was a new level of betrayal, not just a demand for money, but a systematic attempt to cut me off from the people I loved most. The silence was punctuated only by my own thoughts, a whirlwind of what-ifs and whys. Why would they do this? How could a family turn on each other so quickly? I knew, deep down, that this was just the beginning. The emotional manipulation was the opening salvo, a taste of what was to come if I didn't give in. My sorrow began to transform into a slow, simmering anger. The woman who had been a quiet wife and doting grandmother was starting to see a new world, one where the rules of family no longer applied. I was standing on my own, and it was becoming clear that if I was to survive, I had to stop hoping for them to change and start preparing for a fight. The realization, cold and stark as it was, gave me a new kind of strength, a resilience I didn't know I had. It was the first Sunday in a month that Robert and Brenda weren't coming over for dinner. The house, usually bustling with the happy chaos of my grandchildren, was silent. I busied myself dusting old photo frames on the mantelpiece, a small, sad routine. My fingers traced the outline of my favorite picture, the whole family, at Christmas, all of us smiling around the tree. But as I picked it up, something was different. The photo was a digital one, loaded onto a small LCD frame. My son's face was there, and my daughter-in-law's, along with the kids. But I was gone. Erased. And as I stared at the empty space where I should have been, the world tilted on its axis. The silent treatment had just become a visual, heartbreaking act of war. I felt a sharp stab in my gut, a physical pain that rivaled the emotional one. It wasn't an accident. I knew it in my bones. Brenda, with her meticulous attention to detail, had done this on purpose. My mind reeled back to just a week ago, when I had seen a picture of the grandkids on Brenda's social media page. It was a picture of a soccer game, and the children were posing with Robert and Brenda in the background, laughing. I'd looked for myself, for a glimpse of my old life, and found nothing. I'd dismissed it as a simple coincidence, but now, holding the photo frame in my hands, I knew the truth. This was part of a larger, more sinister plan. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. They didn't deserve my tears. I placed the empty frame back on the mantel and walked to the kitchen, my movements stiff and robotic. I opened a small cabinet and pulled out a tin of cookies, a recipe I'd been making for my grandchildren for years. The familiar smell of cinnamon and sugar was a comfort, a small reminder of the good times, but even that was now tainted. Would I ever bake for them again? Would they ever taste my cookies again? It felt like my life was slowly being taken from me, one small, insignificant piece at a time. The emotional wound was deeper now, a gaping hole where my family used to be. I sat at the kitchen table, the tin of cookies on the worn wood, and a new thought, cold and sharp, cut through my sorrow. They were trying to make me feel worthless, to make me believe I was alone. It was psychological warfare. By erasing me from their photos, from their online lives, they were trying to make me feel like I no longer existed, that I was no longer a part of their world. This wasn't about the money anymore. It was about power. And as I looked at the empty photo frame on the mantel, I knew I had a choice. I could give in to their silent pressure, or I could start to fight back. The silence had become a battlefield, and the first shot had been fired. What would the next move be? The empty photo frame sat on the mantel, a silent accusation. My home, which had always felt like a sanctuary, now felt like a lonely museum of a life I no longer had. I spent the next few days in a quiet, simmering anger. I cooked for one, ate at a silent table, and watched television with no one to share a laugh with. I was adrift. And that was when I decided I had to do something, anything, to break the quiet. I would send one last, honest message to my son. I had no idea it would be the first step toward a new, unexpected freedom. My fingers hovered over the keyboard of my phone, a blank text message to Robert. What do you even say to a son who has turned on you? The words "I miss you" felt too raw, too desperate. The words "why" felt too simple. I thought about the first time I saw him. He was just a baby, a tiny bundle in my arms, and I'd promised him a lifetime of love. Where did that promise go? I wanted to believe it was all Brenda's doing, but Robert's silence was a betrayal of its own. It was a refusal to stand up for me, a quiet surrender that felt even more painful than Brenda's overt cruelty. The man who had once brought me flowers from the garden was now a stranger. I typed out a message, my thumbs moving slowly, carefully choosing each word. It wasn't an apology. It was a statement. Robert, I'm hurting. What you and Brenda are doing is wrong. It's not what your father would have wanted. I love you, but I can't pretend that this is okay. The words were a quiet reflection of my pain, a final plea to the son I thought I knew. I read it over a few times, my eyes welling up with tears. I pressed the send button, then hesitated. A small, cold voice of reason, one I hadn't known I had, told me to stop. Why would I beg for a relationship that was conditional? Why would I give them more power over my emotions? What was I fighting for, exactly? A family that only wanted me for my money? It was a low point, a quiet moment of clarity. The family I knew was gone. And I had to let go of the fantasy of getting it back. With a deep, shaky breath, I deleted the text. Every word I'd written was a tribute to a family that no longer existed. I wasn't going to beg for their love. I wasn't going to plead my case. The silence was my reality, but it didn't have to be my prison. I put down my phone and walked over to the front window, staring at the mail truck pulling up to my neighbor, Linda's, house. We'd always been friendly, but never close. My old life had been so focused on Robert and Brenda that I hadn't made time for anyone else. But as I watched Linda pull a letter out of her mailbox, a sudden, powerful thought hit me. My family had turned their backs on me. But the world outside was still there. And it wasn't silent. I had no idea the kindness of a stranger was about to change everything. I was scrolling through my Facebook feed, my thumb moving without thought, when I saw it. A picture of my grandson, Daniel, at his baseball game. He was standing on the pitcher's mound, beaming. But it wasn't Brenda who had posted the photo. It was another parent from the team, a woman named Sarah. Her caption read, "What a great game. So glad Daniel's grandparents were able to make it to cheer him on." My heart stopped. Grandparents? But I wasn't there. And as I zoomed in, a cold, hard knot formed in my stomach. The picture showed Brenda smiling proudly next to a couple I didn't recognize, an older man and woman, their arms around Daniel's shoulders. They weren't family. They were a replacement. And that was the moment I realized they weren't just erasing me, they were replacing me, a betrayal so deep it stole the very air from my lungs. A hot wave of shame and rage washed over me. This wasn't a mistake or an oversight. This was a deliberate, public act of psychological warfare. I remembered how George and I had never missed one of Daniel's games. We had been the proud, loud cheerleaders in the stands, Daniel's biggest fans. It was our thing. Now, some stranger was standing in my place, soaking up the moments that should have been mine. My hands trembled as I stared at the screen, the image of those imposters a cruel mockery of my own heartbreak. It was the erasure strategy in full swing, a calculated effort to make me feel obsolete. The quiet, lonely days of the past week were suddenly filled with a new, searing kind of pain. I thought back to the last time I'd seen Daniel and his sister, Emily, a few weeks before George passed. They had come to visit and had showered me with hugs, whispering secrets and stories into my ear. "We love you, Grandma," Daniel had said, his small arms squeezing me tight. It had been such a simple, pure moment of love. The memory of that hug felt like a distant dream, a painful ghost. I wondered if they knew what was happening, if they understood why I wasn't at their games or their recitals. I couldn't bear the thought that they might think I had abandoned them. I knew I couldn't confront Brenda and Robert about this. That's what they wanted. They wanted me to show I was rattled, to expose my pain so they could use it against me. But their cruelty had backfired. The deep betrayal had forged a new steel in my spine. I was no longer a victim. I was a target. My heart still ached for my grandchildren, but I knew I had to be smart. I had to figure out a way to get back into their lives without begging for an invitation. I closed my laptop, my mind racing. I had to find a different way to fight, a way that honored George's memory and protected my own sanity. I had to find a way to make sure they knew I was still here. I had to find a way to build a bridge to my grandchildren that went around Brenda and Robert. It was a small thing, so small that a few weeks ago I wouldn't have noticed. I was cleaning out my phone, deleting old messages to free up space. I scrolled past old text conversations with friends, neighbors, and then stopped. I had a group chat with my grandchildren that I'd been a part of for years, a thread for birthdays, holidays, and just for fun jokes. The chat icon, a picture of a smiling Daniel, was still there, but when I tapped on it, the conversation was gone. It had been deleted. And that was the moment I realized they weren't just erasing my presence, they were erasing my history. I felt a cold wave of nausea, the digital betrayal a sharp blow to my already bruised heart. It wasn't just a missed photo opportunity, it was a silent, calculated attempt to wipe away years of memories, to make me a stranger to my own grandchildren. I thought back to the silly memes Daniel would send, the short, misspelled messages from Emily telling me about her day. These were not just messages, they were a record of our connection, a timeline of our love. And Brenda had just wiped it clean. The thought of her sitting there, methodically going through the chat and deleting every message, every joke, every I love you, filled me with a fresh, searing anger. A lump formed in my throat as I thought about what this meant. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about control. They wanted to control the narrative, to ensure that as the years passed, my grandchildren would have no proof of our bond, no memories to look back on. They were trying to make me a ghost in my own family's story. I had to believe that my grandchildren would notice my absence, that they would wonder why our conversations had suddenly stopped. But a terrible thought crept into my mind. What if they had been told a lie? What if they believed that I had stopped talking to them? The fear of being painted as the villain, of having their love for me corrupted, was a pain unlike any other. My grief began to transform into a hard, unyielding resolve. I wouldn't let them win. I wouldn't let them rewrite my history. This wasn't just a battle for a fortune anymore, it was a battle for my legacy, for my place in my own family. I wasn't going to get a text back. I wasn't going to get an invitation. I had to find another way to reach out, a way to connect that couldn't be deleted or corrupted. I picked up my phone again, but this time I didn't open my messages. I opened the contacts list and scrolled until I found Sarah's name, the mother who had posted the picture of the baseball game. She was a stranger, but in this new world, a stranger might be the only friend I had. I knew I had to take a chance, to reach out to someone who still lived in the world my family had banished me from. I had no idea that my next move would lead me to a brand new life. The next week brought a quiet that was more jarring than any noise. I tried to focus on my gardening, on the simple rhythm of planting and watering, but my mind kept drifting back to the photos and the deleted messages. I felt like I was living in a different reality from the rest of my family, a lonely island surrounded by a sea of their calculated silence. Then, a thick envelope arrived in the mail, addressed to me. The paper was glossy, with a cartoon image of a baseball bat and ball. My hands trembled as I opened it. It was Daniel's birthday party invitation. The event was just 2 days away, and the address was at a local fun center. A wave of confused joy and suspicion washed over me. Had Robert and Brenda changed their minds? Or was this a new trap? I called my neighbor, Linda, who was now my confidant. They sent an invitation, I said, my voice barely a whisper. To Daniel's party. Linda was skeptical. Are you sure it's for you? Maybe it was a mistake. I looked at the envelope again, my name scrawled on it in an unfamiliar hand. My heart sank as a new thought dawned on me. This invitation wasn't from them. It was a formal, mass-produced card, likely sent to all the kids in Daniel's class. This wasn't a bridge to reconciliation, it was an accidental loophole. And that was the moment I realized they were so focused on their own narrative, they hadn't even thought to check the party guest list. A new kind of anger, colder and more calculated, began to simmer inside me. This wasn't a peace offering. This was an invitation they hadn't meant to send, an oversight in their erasure strategy. My presence at the party would be an emotional landmine, a public disruption to their perfect, fake family. But I knew I had to go. Not for them, but for my grandson. I couldn't let them win. I couldn't let them steal the moments that were meant for me. I had to show Daniel that I still loved him, that I hadn't forgotten him. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of my absence. I spent the next 2 days preparing. I bought the perfect gift, a telescope Daniel had been wanting for months. I dressed in a new dress, a floral print I knew he would like. I rehearsed my entrance, a quiet arrival in a corner of the fun center. I would be a ghost, a silent observer in my own family's world, a reminder of what they had lost. But as I pulled up to the fun center, I saw a familiar car parked out front, Brenda's minivan. My heart pounded against my ribs. There was no turning back now. This wasn't just a birthday party, it was a battleground. And I was ready to fight. The fun center was a cacophony of shrieks and laughter, the air thick with the smell of popcorn and sugar. I spotted Robert and Brenda at a table in the corner, surrounded by other parents and children. They looked like a perfect family, laughing and chatting, a picture-perfect scene that was a stark contrast to my own lonely reality. My heart pounded as I clutched the telescope, a lump forming in my throat. I had rehearsed this moment 100 times in my head, but seeing them so happy, so oblivious to my pain, made my rehearsed calm crumble. I saw Daniel playing with his friends and felt a surge of love so strong it was a physical ache. I had to see him. I had to make sure he knew I was there. I walked toward the table, a polite smile fixed on my face. A few parents I knew gave me small, cautious nods. I kept my eyes on Daniel, who was now opening a gift. When I reached the table, Brenda's head snapped up. Her smile froze, and her eyes, full of venom, narrowed. "Margaret," she said, her voice dripping with ice. "What are you doing here?" It was a public challenge, a direct confrontation. The other parents at the table fell silent, their eyes darting between us. I stood my ground, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "I'm here to celebrate Daniel's birthday," I said, my voice steady, though my hands were shaking. I placed the telescope on the table, the box a quiet statement of my love. Brenda's face twisted into a mask of pure fury. She leaned forward, her voice low and menacing. "You weren't invited. This is a private family event." The lie was so blatant, so cruel, it stunned me into silence. The other parents, who knew me, looked at each other awkwardly. One of the fathers, a man I vaguely remembered from a school fundraiser, cleared his throat. "Brenda, I saw her invitation." His words were a small act of defiance, a quiet crack in her carefully constructed narrative. But Brenda ignored him, her gaze fixed on me. "Get out, Margaret," she hissed. "You're ruining everything." And that was the emotional climax. I looked at Robert, begging him with my eyes to say something, anything. But he just stared at the floor, his face a mask of shame and cowardice. In that moment, surrounded by strangers and the family that had disowned me, I realized a terrible, liberating truth. They were a lost cause. Their greed had consumed them, and they would never be the family I had once known. I looked at Daniel, who was staring at me, his eyes wide with confusion. I couldn't let him see me cry. I forced a smile and blew him a kiss. "Happy birthday, Daniel," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. I turned and walked away, the laughter and screams of the fun center fading behind me. I had lost the battle for the family, but I hadn't lost the war. The fight for my life had just begun. The drive home was a blur. My vision was swimming, not with tears, but with a cold, blinding rage. I had walked into a battlefield, armed with nothing but a birthday gift and a grandmother's love, and I had been publicly humiliated. When I got home, I collapsed onto the sofa, still in my floral dress, the silence of the house a suffocating blanket. I replayed the scene over and over in my head, the look on Brenda's face, the cowardly silence of my son. And the look on Daniel's face. That was the memory that broke me. His confused eyes, so innocent, so trusting. I had failed him. I had let them win, and now he would think I was a villain. I finally let the tears come, hot and angry, a flood of grief for the family I had lost. I stayed on the sofa for hours, the house growing dark around me. The phone sat on the coffee table, a cold, unfeeling thing that had brought me so much pain. I felt completely defeated, stripped of my dignity and my purpose. What was the point of a fortune if you had no one to share it with? The money, once a symbol of George's love and hard work, now felt like a curse, a poison that had turned my family against me. I felt a terrible sense of shame, as if I had brought this on myself. The emotional low point had arrived, a dark and lonely valley where the echoes of Brenda's hissed words haunted me. Just as the last light of day faded from the sky, a quiet chime from my phone jolted me from my stupor. It wasn't a text or a call from Robert or Brenda. It was a Facebook message notification from Sarah, the woman who had posted the photo of the baseball game. I hesitated for a long moment, my finger hovering over the screen, half expecting more lies or accusations. I had nothing left to lose. I opened the message. "Hi Margaret," it began. "I just wanted to say that I am so sorry for what happened at the party. It was wrong. Daniel was so excited about the telescope. He kept asking who it was from, and Brenda just told him it was a family friend. He knows it was you. He told me he saw you walk away. If you ever want to come to a game, I can make sure you get a proper invitation. Just let me know. I'd love for you to sit with me. I've heard you are the best cheerleader in the stands." The words hit me with the force of a tidal wave. They weren't a lifeline, but they were something. An acknowledgement. A small, unexpected act of kindness from a stranger. It was a tiny flicker of light in the vast darkness of my grief, a hint that my grandchildren were not lost to me, and that there was a world outside the one Brenda and Robert had created. It was the first step on a new path, one I had to find on my own. I had no idea what came next, but I knew I couldn't give up. Not yet. I stared at Sarah's message for a long time, the words rereading themselves in my mind. It was a small thing, just a few lines of text from a woman I barely knew. But it was a small thing that had just ripped a hole in the suffocating silence Brenda and Robert had built around me. It was a lifeline. It was proof that my grandchildren weren't completely lost to me, and that there were people in the world who could see their manipulation for what it was. The shame and despair that had been a physical weight on my chest began to lift, replaced by a new, unfamiliar sensation, the quiet, steady hum of possibility. I had a way back in, not through the front door they had slammed in my face, but through a side window they had carelessly left open. My fingers, no longer shaking, tapped out a reply. "Thank you, Sarah. That means the world to me." I waited a moment, then added, "I would love to come to the next game." "When is it?" The message was simple, direct, and brave. It was the first step back into the world, a world where I could still be a grandmother to my grandchildren. When her reply came, a short message with the time and date of the next game, a small, genuine smile touched my lips for the first time in weeks. I wasn't alone anymore. The morning of the game, I felt a nervous flutter in my stomach that reminded me of my first day of school. I dressed carefully, putting on a light blue sweater and a pair of comfortable jeans. I didn't want to be the sad, old widow anymore. I wanted to be a grandmother again. I drove to the park, my hands gripping the steering wheel, the sun warm on my face.